This is just something I'm adding because we are talking about geoengineering and sequestering carbon and other ways to reduce total emissions. And the idea of net zero is now making the rounds and sometimes sounds like a buzzword because none of the technologies needed are really in place at scale. So there is this article by Joeri Welch, I won't try to say it. But anyway, it came out in Nature just very recently this year, less than 2 months ago. And it says industries such as aviation do not have clear roadmaps for tackling carbon dioxide emissions. This is true for many things. Plus, people are not always very clear on what they mean by net zero. Is it just CO2? Is it CO2 equivalent, where you include also other emissions? Do you include only your emissions or also your supply chain and so on and so forth? This is the kind of figure we have seen now several times. This is looking at global CO2 equivalent emissions, so it includes non-CO2 emissions such as methane, N2O, and fluorinated gases using the approach of global warming potential over 100 years. This also has to be done very carefully because the numbers can change depending on how you convert the non-CO2 emissions into CO2 emissions. So here we are going from 2010 and looking at the targets, temperature targets, and needed timelines for net zero. So this is from this particular reference. So to reaching a net zero CO2 target, residual CO2 emissions are balanced by an equal amount of CO2 removal. So here you have CO2 removal ramping up over time. We are already in fact behind, but let's say we start in 2030, but you can see that these emissions are supposed to have started to drop by 2020 already. COVID is in place, wreaking havoc in some places, but in general, now economic recoveries will become the main goals, and then climate goals may take a backseat unless the plans to work on climate actions actually are part of the economic recovery and employment generation and so on, which is what Biden administration in the US is arguing for, including their global need. So here you are just balancing CO2, but at some point reaching net zero GHG target would require that you not only draw down residual CO2 and other GHG, also have to be included. So now you have a bigger CO2 drawdown required and will continue on to 2100, where there are unavoidable CO2 and non-CO2 emissions which have to be compensated by drawing down. So global warming implications associated with that, estimated global temperature peaks and declines under net zero GHG emissions. So here are global average temperatures, 1.5 degree target over here, 2 degree target over here, and these are the ranges. So net zero CO2 target, global warming roughly stabilizes, but we have cumulative CO2 that's there that will go on for centuries in terms of where it will be taken up in the land, in ocean, vegetation, etc., etc. So net zero GHG target global warming peaks and then begins to decline. So continued decline is accelerated by global net negative greenhouse gas emissions. So this is out to 2100 with a large range of potential temperatures, and there are many details. If you exceed 1.5 or 2, is it bad? How long can you exceed it, and how quickly do you have to ramp back down? What are the political implications? What are the social and behavioral implications if you cross 1.5 after having touted it as an absolute red line not to be crossed, and it crosses and people say, well, nothing really happened, and then what happens? So all sorts of issues are involved there. In terms of the three items by which to improve net zero emission pathways. One of the things that's discussed is now will so-called offsets be part of the net zero targets? Will you be able to emit more than net zero and then offset it by, let's say, planting trees somewhere? This is a big challenge because the amount of space you need to grow enough trees to offset is not trivial. And in fact, some ecologists like Bonnie Waring would argue that there aren't enough trees in the world to offset carbon emissions, and there never will be. So offset is not a good idea. Local reductions are the best way to go about it. And this has been argued by many people, and in general, so-called embedded carbon is also needed to be accounted for. In other words, where you consume things rather than where they are manufactured. For example, if China is manufacturing things, emitting carbon there, and then exporting things to other countries, and they are using calculations where they do not include their consumption and net emission at source, then also you can have all kinds of issues on how to count net zero emissions at each place. Okay, so the checklist for rigorous and clear net zero plans are proposed in this article is scope, fairness, and roadmap. Scope: what global temperature goal does this plan contribute to stabilize global temperature or see it peak and then decline? What is the target date for net zero? Has to be stated clearly. Which greenhouse gases are considered? Is it just CO2 or also other non-CO2 greenhouse gases? How are greenhouse gases aggregated? Are you using the global warming potential over 100 years or some other metric? This can make a significant difference. What is the extent of the emissions over which territories, with timeframes or activities? What are the relative contributions of reductions, removals, and offsets? Right? You have to say how you are reducing, for example, emissions per GDP and carbon per or energy per GDP and carbon or carbon equivalent for energy and so on. What are the relative contributions? Okay, I already said. How will risks be managed around removals and offsets? So the approaches come with risks and whether if you're using offsets, they also have a kind of risk associated with them that they have to be explicitly accounted for in terms of how they will be managed. Fairness. What principles are being applied? Would the global climate goal be achieved if everyone did this? So there has to be some global accounting in terms of the individual contributions adding to global targets. What are the consequences for others if these principles are applied universally? So fairness, countries' interests in their own growth and standards of living cannot ever be eliminated, so that has to be accounted for in these fairness. How will your target affect others' capacity to achieve net zero and their pursuit of other sustainable development goals? So here it is the making room for countries that haven't been historically part of the global warming problem and emissions levels. What in terms of roadmaps, not having all the technology in place, having roadmaps and long-term plans is a bit tricky, but nonetheless, one needs to have a framework for it. What milestones and policies will support achievement? What monitoring and review system will be used to assess progress and revise the targets? So targets have to be revised along the way. Will net zero be maintained, or is it a step towards net negative? Are we going to get stuck at net zero, always compensating for emissions, or are we going to actually head towards net negative? Okay. Good news is that IEA is going to produce world's first comprehensive roadmap to net zero emissions, and we will see how people buy into it and what kind of portfolios get set up making choices. In a pivotal year, new IEA projects including Special Net Zero Report in May and Clean Energy Transitions summit with UK in March will build momentum to help underpin success of COP26. This, I think, has been moved to November now because of COVID. But there is a net zero tracker which looks at the 2021 scorecard with some small countries having already achieved net zero. Other countries have already made it a law to reach by 2045, 2050, and so on. And there are proposed legislations in some countries. And then there are lots of countries where policy, in policy document, so there are net zeros included in the policy documents in these countries. And fortunately involves Kazakhstan, for example, China, of course, Slovenia, what other country we can point out? Marshall Islands, Vatican City, and so on. And there are all these other countries, which is a significantly long list, which is encouraging, where discussions about net zero are underway. And this includes pretty much all the countries you want to see. Let's see, Italy, Mexico, Netherlands. I was looking for India, which I should have done before, but anyway, this is a fairly long list, so net zero discussions are underway pretty much across the world. So net zero is a serious issue, serious consideration, but it has to be made sure that it just doesn't become a buzzword and that there are steps taken in terms of technology transfer, funding, accounting for disparities, unintended consequences, and so on along the way. So this I wanted to just add as a special podcast to the course, separate from the books I used.